Welcome to the second in a three-part video series from the Climate Smart Land Network, a Manomet Climate Services initiative. This is part 2, Forest Response to Climate Change, which discusses the many ways our changing climate is affecting our forests. Each video in this series corresponds to part of our Climate Change and Forestry Handbook. While this video provides a broad overview of the topic, we recommend the handbook for those interested in more detailed information, as well as a way to interface with our archive of research bulletins. You can find all these materials online at climatesmartnetwork.org. This video will address 4 major questions that outline what you need to know about the impacts of climate change for North American forests in particular. The first is how the distribution and abundance of different tree species will change over time. Second, we'll cover how changing climate may be altering disturbance patterns. Then we'll look at the potential effects on the growth and productivity of forests. And finally, we'll conclude with a discussion about uncertainty and some of the major remaining unknowns. The changes discussed here have important implications for the resilience of our forests and the industries that rely on them. We'll revisit these questions to recap along the way. Given that each tree species is adapted to a particular range of climate conditions, the first question is how these species will respond to the ongoing and anticipated changes in temperature and precipitation. Species essentially have 4 options available to them. The first is toleration, or simply staying put and adapting to the new conditions in place. The second is shifting their habitat, expanding or contracting their distribution to take advantage of newly available habitat or remaining refugia within their current range. A third option is migration, moving across the landscape to follow or find more favorable conditions. And finally, the species that cannot cope with the changing conditions may eventually die off. In most cases, this will likely be local extirpation, but extinction of some species is possible over the long term. The question of tree species migration in particular garners a great deal of interest and debate, especially in terms of how quickly these changes may become apparent. In fact, shifts in the distribution and abundance of some tree species have already been documented and linked to changes in climate. Changes have been observed in boreal, temperate, and even tropical biomes, and include upward shifts in elevation or latitude for some species, as well as some changes in relative abundance. But not all tree species are responding yet, and discernible change is limited so far. If we want to understand how these species shifts may continue to play out in the future, we can gain insight by looking into the past with evidence from Paleo Ecological research, which is the study of fossil plants and animals and their interactions with their environment. Or we can look to the future using computer models. We'll first look at what the Paleo perspective can teach us. These maps depict the estimated distribution and abundance of various spruce, ash, and birch species 21,000 years ago during the last ice age, when a vast ice sheet, which you see in blue, covered a large portion of North America. The gray and green colors represent areas where that species was present and its relative abundance, where the darker the color, the higher the abundance, based on pollen accumulation that provides a record of past vegetation. While there were other species present on the landscape at this point, we'll focus on these 3 as examples. Note the timestamp in the upper right. Now we can watch as time moves forward to the present day and see how these species responded to the long-term warming out of the last ice age. We see significant changes in the range and abundance of these species, and the paleo evidence shows us that tree species respond independently of each other. They don't necessarily move as cohesive forest types. So there are points in time where we see novel associations of species that don't occur together today. And there's also a time lag involved. The change you just observed played out over 20,000 years, but the warming we're experiencing today is orders of magnitude faster, which will certainly challenge the migration speed and adaptation potential of many species. Now we'll look at what forest modeling can tell us about future changes in forest composition. There's a spectrum of modeling approaches used in research, which can be broadly sorted into 2 categories, empirical and process-based. Empirical models quantify the statistical relationships between where species occur and environmental variables, such as climate and soils, then use those correlations to project where suitable habitat will be in the future. Process-based models are more complex and simulate the actual underlying processes, such as growth, disturbance, and regeneration. Each approach has its strengths and weaknesses, and an increasing number of hybrid models are used in research. The Climate Smart Land Network Bulletin on modeling future forests provides information and links to some key forest models, as well as some guidance on how best to use the outputs of these models. While there are many models out there focusing on different regions and species, they all agree that growing conditions will change. Some species will successfully adjust or even perform better under the new conditions and increase, but others will be limited in their ability to survive as the climate moves farther away from the conditions to which they are adapted, and they will decrease in abundance. And for some species, the results are mixed, with some models predicting an increase, others a decrease, or disagreement on the magnitude of those changes. We can look at tree species in the northeastern U.S. as an example, specifically the results of an assessment from the U.S. Forest Service that incorporated results from 3 different models: an empirical, a process-based, and a hybrid model, as well as expert input. Among the species projected to increase are several oaks, black cherry, American elm, and others. Among those projected to decrease, there are several spruce species, northern white cedar, paper birch, and eastern hemlock. And there are a few with mixed results, including some of the most commercially and culturally important species in the Northeast, such as balsam fir, eastern white pine, and sugar maple. Reflective of this, the forest types determined to have the lowest vulnerability to climate change over the next century are the central hardwood pine and pitch pine scrub oak types, while the spruce fir and mixed conifer forests have moderate to high vulnerability. An important and related question is where we might expect to see these changes first. Take the range of these 2 fir species as an example. Initial changes in forest composition will generally be at the limits of a species range, with expansion at the leading edge in northern and higher elevations, and contraction at the trailing edge in lower altitudinal latitudinal limits. However, changes in the relative abundance within a species range are also likely, and may be detectable before obvious shifts in the overall species range. In fact, some changes in relative abundance have already been documented among tree species in the eastern U.S. So to recap, tree species will respond to changing climate through adaptation, movement, or extirpation, and possibly extinction. We see that all these strategies were employed by species in the past, and there's evidence that some of these changes are already underway today. Species move independently, not as cohesive forest types, so we may see some novel species associations and natural communities, and there will be significant time lags involved. The rate of change today will challenge the ability of most species to keep pace. And finally, initial shifts will likely be evident at range margins and as changes in relative abundance within species ranges. Now to the question of changing disturbance. Disturbance shapes the character and composition of forest ecosystems. Wildfires, blowdowns, pests, and other disturbance agents affect the spatial patterns of vegetation and ecosystem processes, often leaving an imprint that shapes forest dynamics for decades to centuries after the initial disturbance event. Climate change is expected to alter the frequency, extent, and severity of various types of forest disturbance, and there is some evidence that disturbance regimes have already changed in certain places, with important implications for forest health. Perhaps one of the biggest concerns is the increasing vulnerability of forests to drought as the climate warms. By increasing evaporative demand, warmer temperatures exacerbate the impacts of even mild to moderate drought events, and evidence suggests these so-called hotter droughts are already increasing rates of forest mortality worldwide. Increases in the size, frequency, and severity of wildfires linked to warmer and drier conditions have been observed in some regions, and this increase in fire potential is generally expected to continue. Rising temperatures will have the greatest impact on fire regimes in moisture-limited rather than fuel-limited forest ecosystems. Heavier precipitation associated with the warmer atmosphere affects peak stream flow and is already having notable impacts on forest infrastructure, especially the resilience of stream crossings, often requiring sizing up culverts or moving to open bottom structures to accommodate larger flows during heavy rain events. A decrease in the depth and duration of snowpack is also expected across many mid and high latitude areas, as well as high elevation sites. This will affect seasonal water availability and winter soil temperatures, with a possible increase in root freezing for some species in the absence of sufficient snowpack to insulate the ground. It's also likely that the area typically affected by freezing rain events will move north as the climate warms, changing the areas most prone to damage from ice storms. Wind is another chronic disturbance agent that shapes forests, but there's a lot of uncertainty about how climate change will affect winds and storminess at a regional scale. However, wind-related disturbance is expected to increase under warmer and wetter conditions. The chance of uprooting and stem breakage will be greatest where soils are softened by increased precipitation, or where frozen soils typically provide protection from wind throw through better anchorage, as the period of the year with unfrozen soils continues to lengthen. Disturbance from pests and disease will be a source of rapid forest change. This includes changes in the distribution, outbreak frequency, and infectiousness of various forest pests and pathogens. For example, milder winters are increasing overwinter survival of pests that were previously kept in check by winter cold. In other places, a longer growing season has allowed certain pests to complete multiple life cycles per year, increasing outbreak severity. Forests will have the greatest vulnerability in water-stressed regions, and some of these changes are already evident, particularly in the western United States. A major concern is the potential for multiple disturbance agents to interact in a way that accelerates or intensifies forest damage. When multiple stressors manifest simultaneously, it significantly diminishes the ability of forests to resist or recover from the disturbance. We need look no farther than California to see an example of this dynamic in play, where the combination of warmer temperatures, drought, and beetle outbreaks has wreaked havoc on the forest, resulting in almost 130 million dead trees. Under warm, dry conditions, this provided the fuel for record-breaking wildfires, and research suggests recent climate change increased the severity of these impacts. To recap, there's evidence that disturbance patterns are already changing, with implications for forest health and composition. Disturbance from drought, fire, and pests is expected to increase under warmer and drier conditions, while disturbance from wind and pathogens is expected to increase under warmer and wetter conditions. The biggest risk is posed by the interaction of multiple forest stressors, which can exacerbate impacts and diminish resilience. The next question is how these changes in climate might affect the growth and productivity of forests. Some aspects of climate change will actually benefit forests and other plant communities. This includes a longer growing season, which allows for a longer period of photosynthesis and growth. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is also a key ingredient in plant photosynthesis, and higher CO2 levels in the atmosphere means there's more available for plants. This can have a fertilizing effect that boosts photosynthesis and growth. For some species, elevated CO2 can also help increase water use efficiency, the amount of water lost through foliage to the amount of carbon gained, which can play an important role in increasing drought tolerance. In fact, a global increase in vegetation productivity has been documented over several decades, with greening observed over 25 to 50% of the global land area with vegetation. The research suggests the majority of this trend can be explained by CO2 fertilization, followed by nitrogen deposition, changing climate, and land cover change. While this greening trend is significant and points to a growth boost from changing conditions, it has not been uniform across the globe. Ultimately, the net benefit to forests is determined by the trade-off between the factors that boost growth and the presence and magnitude of the stressors discussed earlier. In the absence of any stressors, forests will feel the full benefit of factors like elevated CO2 and a longer growing season. And where some stressors exist, they can help counteract any negative impacts. But in some cases, the growth benefits will be outweighed by other constraints, like disturbance or limiting nutrients. Of course, forest management plays a role here as well, and can help balance the scale, but it's important for managers to understand both sides of this equation. To recap, forests will benefit from longer growing seasons and higher CO2, which will boost growth. And this has already contributed to an observed global greening. And this increasing forest productivity may continue where it's not offset by increasing moisture deficits, disturbance, or other limiting nutrients, or where these countervailing factors can be successfully managed. Finally, to the question of uncertainty. Even if we could perfectly predict how the climate would change, there would still be uncertainty about exactly how natural systems will respond. The greatest uncertainties regarding forest response to climate change are related to estimating the pace of change. While we know species will shift over time, based on modeling and paleoecological evidence, we still don't know exactly where, how quickly, and to what degree our forests will change in the near term. determining whether changes will be a net positive or negative for particular species and community types, which is a challenge because climate change presents a mix of risks and opportunities for many forest species. Accounting for the adaptive capacity of individuals and populations. We don't know the physiological limits, tolerances, and life history traits of all species, nor do we have a complete knowledge of the adaptive potential of the genetic variation within each species. And the latest genetics research has also revealed that gene expression can be influenced by environmental factors, and those changes can sometimes be inherited by offspring, a phenomenon known as epigenetics. This has important implications for the adaptability and potential plasticity of different tree species in a novel climate. It suggests that some species may be more resilient to change than we might expect based on their current response to stress. And finally, anticipating the role of extreme events and pest pathogens in reshaping ecosystems has many unknowns. Climate change will affect pest populations in ways that may help or hurt forests, depending on the species and the region in question. While the interaction of changing climate with insects and diseases is likely to create some of the most immediate climate-related impacts, there is still limited knowledge about the life cycle, population dynamics, and environmental tolerance of many pests, including considerable uncertainty about how they will fare in a changing climate. And while it's recognized that extreme events such as drought and fire are likely to have an outsized influence on forest health and succession in coming decades, the extent of potential forest mortality or damage from these events is difficult to predict for any given region. So to recap, the biggest and most immediate climate-related impacts on our forests are likely to be from changing pest and disease dynamics and extreme events. And many of the anticipated changes are already underway, including shifting tree species distributions and changes in disturbance patterns. The biggest remaining unknowns are related to estimating the pace of change, the innate adaptive capacity of various species, and the net positive versus negative impacts overall. This concludes Part 2, Forest Response to Climate Change. Thank you for watching, and please access the companion handbook available at this link for more information.